On the 14th of January, 1892, a young man lay dying at Sandringham House in Norfolk. He was just 28 years old. His name was Prince Albert Victor, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales and the second in line to the throne of the United Kingdom. The cause of his death was the so-called Russian flu pandemic. This deadly virus had swept across Europe between 1889 and 1892, killing an estimated 1 million people. Albert Victor was one of its victims. His death sent shockwaves through the British royal family, because Albert Victor was not just any prince, he was the heir to the heir. His father, Albert Edward, was next after Queen Victoria, and Albert Victor was next after his father. When he died, everything changed. His younger brother, George Frederick, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. George, who had spent his life in the shadow of his older brother, now became the second in line to the throne. Queen Victoria was already in her 70s. She had ruled Britain since 1837 and was showing signs of age. George's father, Albert Edward, was also in poor health. He was a heavy smoker and had lived a life of excess. Contemporaries knew that he might not have many years left. This meant that George could well become king sooner than anyone had expected. The line of succession was now fragile, and there was a pressing need to secure it. Within weeks of Albert Victor's death, a plan was put in motion. Before he died, Albert Victor had proposed to a young woman named Mary of Teck. She was his cousin and a member of the extended royal family. The proposal had happened just 6 weeks before he fell ill. Now, with Albert Victor gone, the marriage plans were altered. It was decided that George would marry Mary instead. The wedding took place at St. James Palace on the 6th of July, 1893. But this was not a love match in the traditional sense. It was an arranged marriage, hastily cobbled together in response to a sudden death. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Would this marriage work? Would George and Mary love each other? Would they be able to rule together as king and queen? The answer would take decades to unfold. George and Mary would eventually rise to the throne in 1910. They would become the first monarchs of the House of Windsor, and they would guide Britain through the First World War, the Great Depression, and the rise of Hitler. But on that cold January day in 1892, none of that was known. All anyone knew was that a young prince was dead, and his younger brother, a man who never expected to be king, was now destined for the crown. This is the story of King George V and Mary of Teck, a story of duty, love, war, and the transformation of the British monarchy.
The man known to history as King George V was born on the 3rd of June, 1865, at Marlborough House in Westminster, London. He came into the world during the height of the Victorian era, when the British Empire was at its peak. His father was Albert Edward, Prince of Wales. He was the eldest son of Queen Victoria, who had been the ruler of Britain since 1837. As the eldest male child, Albert Edward was the heir presumptive to the throne. But his relationship with the Queen was often strained. Victoria saw his son as frivolous and unruly, a man who preferred partying to royal duties. George's mother was Alexandra of Denmark. She was a princess from the royal house of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg. She had married Albert Edward in 1863 and brought a touch of European royalty into the British court. George was not their first child. In January 1864, just months after their wedding, Prince Albert Victor had been born. He was the first son and automatically became second in line to the throne after his father. When George was born the following year, he became third in line. He was always the younger brother, always in the shadow of his sibling. The couple had 4 more children after George, 3 daughters named Louise, Victoria, and Maud, and a son named Alexander John, who was born prematurely in 1871 and died just 24 hours later. As a child of the royal family, George was not raised by his parents. This was typical for the age. He was largely cared for by a series of nannies and household staff across the royal palaces at Windsor, Westminster, Sandringham, and elsewhere. He would have had long periods of little contact with his mother and father. George and his elder brother Albert were close enough in age that they were educated together. Their primary tutor from 1871 onwards was John Nail Dalton. He was a Church of England clergyman who had previously served as a private chaplain to Queen Victoria herself. It was the Queen who recommended Dalton, believing that the boys' father was neglecting their education. Dalton provided them with a varied curriculum over the next decade, much of it focused on Protestant texts such as the Book of Common Prayer, but they also studied the Greek and Roman classics. The humanities were prized above the sciences in the late Victorian educational curriculum. George was not an especially gifted student, but he was doubtlessly the more able of the 2 brothers. Albert was prone to laziness and showed an obtuse attitude toward their tutor. Conversely, George and Dalton developed a rapport that grew into a lifelong friendship. When George was just 12 years old, his father made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He decided that his 2 sons would benefit from joining the British Navy and exploring the world. They were enrolled in the Royal Navy in 1877. In 1779, after some initial seafaring training, the 2 young princes were sent off with Dalton as their tutor on board the HMS Bacchante. It was a newly built corvette of the Royal Navy, one of a new class of torpedo carriage ships. Queen Victoria was much concerned that her 2 grandsons would be lost at sea, but her father was a stern disciplinarian. He stated that they needed to see the world. To convince her mother of the sturdiness of the vessel, the Bacchante was ordered to sail into a gale-force storm near Britain in 1879. When it emerged unscathed, Victoria agreed to let her 2 grandsons embark on the journey. The 2 boys and Dalton spent the next 3 years voyaging on the Bacchante. The ship had been tasked with patrolling the world's sea lanes at a time when the Royal Navy effectively policed the world's oceans. In total, they traveled over 40,000 miles. They visited the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, South America, South Africa, China, Japan, and Australia. In Japan, they were among the first British royals to have direct experience of the rapid modernization of Japanese society. They even met Emperor Meiji while there in 1881. The boys were also present in South Africa for some of the First Boer War. Accounts of their adventures were later collected together and published in 1886 as The Cruise of Her Majesty's Ship Bacchante, 1879 to 1882. Life at sea seemed to have suited George. Following his return to England, it was determined that he would continue on as a commander in the Royal Navy. Conversely, Albert, as the second in line to the throne, was sent off to Trinity College, Cambridge, to continue the education he had apparently had little taste for under Dalton's tutelage. George was sent to Malta, where his uncle, Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's second eldest son, was serving as a senior figure of the British Mediterranean Fleet. He became a vice admiral in 1882 and commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean Fleet in 1886. Under his uncle, George continued his training as a naval commander throughout the mid-1880s.
In the late 1880s and early 1890s, George had reached an age and level of experience that resulted in him being made a commander of several ships in the Royal Navy. One was the HMS Thrush, a Redbreast-class gunboat, which he took command of in 1890 during a tour of the Western Atlantic. He largely operated between Nova Scotia and northeastern Canada and the British colony of Bermuda. Shortly thereafter, he was placed in charge of the newly commissioned HMS Melampus, an Apollo-class cruiser, which he was given command of in 1891. But it would be his last active command, because events in Britain in the early 1990s would change the future course of his life forever. George's coronation as King George V of Britain and Emperor of India took place at Westminster Abbey in London on the 22nd of June, 1911. His wife, Mary, was crowned as Queen Consort alongside him. It was a grand ceremony attended by an enormous number of royal families and monarchs from across Europe. The guest list read like a who's who of European royalty. Members of the German imperial family attended. Numerous other German princes and princesses were present. Representatives of the Tsar of Bulgaria came. The Romanian royal family sent delegates. Archduke Karl of Austria represented Emperor Franz Joseph. Even the Crown Prince of the Ottoman Empire attended as a stand-in for the Sultan. Within just a few years, many of these imperial and royal houses would be shattered by the First World War. Few could have guessed it in the summer of 1911. This would be one of the last times the many royal lines of old Europe would gather in one place for such an event. In tandem, the Festival of Empire was held at the Crystal Palace in London to celebrate George's coronation. The Crystal Palace had first been built to house the Great Exposition of 1851. Now it became home to a vast array of scenes designed to showcase the might of the British Empire at its height. 300 buildings replicating elements of other buildings from across the empire were reconstructed inside the Crystal Palace. But even as the coronation plans were underway, a political crisis was raging in Britain. This crisis involved the new king in a surprising way. By the early 20th century, most people believed the monarch's role was simply to approve what Parliament decided. George found himself forced to do much more than that. At the heart of the matter was the people's budget. The Liberal Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George, had first tried to introduce it in April 1909. The budget was very progressive for its time. Lloyd George stated that it was effectively a wartime budget, with the enemy being poverty and squalor in Britain's working class and industrial communities. Yet, the people's budget provoked a furious response. The conservative-dominated House of Lords refused to approve the budget. Traditionally, the Lords was seen as a rubber-stamping body. It was not supposed to block legislation that had passed through the House of Commons. The impasse over the people's budget had provoked a constitutional crisis in the last months of King Edward VIII's reign. By the time George ascended the throne, the budget had been allowed to pass through the Lords without a vote. The immediate crisis was over, but the new king was immediately faced with calls for constitutional reform of the House of Lords. This was to ensure such a crisis never happened again. Within days of his ascension, George was being petitioned by the Liberal Prime Minister Herbert Asquith about various methods of constitutional reform. This was particularly necessary because British parliamentary politics in the early 1910s was balanced on a knife's edge. The Unionists and the Irish Parliamentary Party often held the balance of power between the Liberals and Conservatives. One proposal was that George would agree to the creation of a large number of new liberal peers. This would turn the political balance in the House of Lords in favor of the Liberals and their allies. George was not entirely favorable to the idea of politicizing the creation of noble titles in this way. In any event, the Conservatives became more inclined to make concessions when they learned of this plan. As a result, a compromise was reached in the shape of the Parliament Act of 1911. The act contained two main provisions. First, it stated that the House of Lords could not veto bills relating to the budget and other financial issues once they had passed through the House of Commons. Second, in return, the Conservatives received an unofficial promise that their majority in the House of Lords would not be overcome by packing it with newly created Liberal peers. George gave his assent to the act in August 1911. This was one of the most significant reforms of the constitutional relationship between the upper and lower houses of Parliament in modern British history. Whatever government was going to control Britain, one of their primary problems was going to be Ireland. Ireland had long been a thorn in the empire. As England had expanded its political control across the British Isles, it had managed to bring Wales and Scotland under British control, but Ireland had always been problematic. Successive waves of conquest and colonization between the 11th and 16th centuries had created an English Protestant landholding class in Ireland. But the bulk of the population remained Irish and Roman Catholic, broadly opposed to British rule. The problem was compounded by a Scottish Presbyterian majority in the Northern Ireland who were opposed to the Catholics further south. By George's time, politicians in England were determined to find a solution to the endless unrest in Ireland. They wanted to grant some form of self-determination to the island. If needed, they would separate the northern counties from the southern ones, but the political environment was highly fractious by the early 1910s. As a consequence, it was decided that George should quickly visit Ireland following his accession. The goal was to reinforce the ties between the monarchy and the crown's subjects in Ireland. George and Mary arrived at Dunleary near Dublin on the 8th of July, 1911, just over 2 weeks after the coronation. The entourage was considerable. 8 carriages were needed to bring the King and Queen to Dublin Castle, where they resided during their visit. Visits to Phoenix Park and Leopardstown Racecourse followed, as well as charitable endeavors like a visit to a hospital in Dublin. Much effort was made to shroud the royal visit in a celebratory atmosphere, but tensions were brewing underneath. Many of Dublin Corporation's politicians were nationalists and socialists who favored complete independence from Britain. They refused to participate in the events around the royal visit. The King and Queen's visit to Cork, a Republican-dominated city in the south, was undertaken in a very tense atmosphere. It was clear the new monarch was not welcome there. This aside, George and Mary's route through Dublin was often lined by people cheering them. When he left Ireland 5 days later, the king might have imagined that with the right policies, the island could still be reconciled to British rule. He would learn in time that this was certainly not the case. Ireland and all other parts of the empire were drawn increasingly towards conflict in the first years of George's reign. Europe's great powers had been increasingly antagonistic towards one another. The Empire of Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire were rivals for control over the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire, the dominant regional power for centuries, was in terminal decline. The French Republic had old grievances against the German Empire from the conquest of its eastern provinces during the Franco-Prussian War in the early 1970s. Britain had its own growing rivalry with Germany, the newly emergent continental power. Yet few saw a war of the kind which erupted in the summer of 1914 coming. In the end, it was a regional crisis that cast the continent into war. The assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, by a Serb nationalist in Sarajevo, set off a cascade of events. By the start of August 1914, the British, French, and Russians were at war with the Germans, Austrians, and Turks. As monarch, it fell to George to oversee the council, which decided that Britain would declare war on Germany. He referred to these events in his diary later that day as a terrible catastrophe, but like many others, he naively believed that the First World War would be a quick affair. Instead, it dragged on for over 4 years of bloody trench warfare. George became Duke of York in 1892 after his brother died. This title had been given to second-in-line heirs for centuries. His new position meant he had to quit active service with the Royal Navy. Any naval duty that might endanger his life was now forbidden. Following his marriage to Mary in 1893, their roles as Duke and Duchess were mostly ceremonial. They were meant to introduce the British people to the man who would one day be king. Social events and photo opportunities became their daily routine. George was not a party lover like his father. He preferred a quiet life at York Cottage in Sandringham. Mary, on the other hand, enjoyed London's social scene. They split their time between both places. The marriage began under unusual circumstances. George had fallen in love with Julie Stoner, a commoner, but it was made clear that a future king could not marry a commoner. That was completely forbidden. Instead, George married Mary. This was not a bad thing for Mary. George was a man of duty, devoted to his royal responsibilities. Their marriage had affection, though there was a strange level of formality between them. Often, George would write his appreciation for Mary in letters. She would respond, saying it was wonderful to hear this in writing, but she added that she would not mind if he simply told her in person. This formality was a strange quirk of their relationship. Children soon followed. Edward was born in the summer of 1894. Albert, the future King George VI, followed in December 1895. Their only daughter, Mary, was born in 1897. Then Henry in 1900, George in 1905, and John in 1905. All except John lived long lives. John developed severe epilepsy and died in 1919 at just 13 years old. He was kept away from public events and lived mostly at Sandringham. As parents, George and Mary were not easy to define. George was a strict disciplinarian like his own father. He instilled significant fear in his children. One observer said George ran his family like a Navy captain trying to control a mutiny. Mary was closer to her children. They often looked to her to temper their father's harsh parenting. When they went on a tour of the empire in 1901, both were upset at leaving their children for so long. They have been criticized for hiding Prince John away, but epilepsy was not well understood then. Exposing him to public events might have worsened his condition. It is unfair to blame them for not understanding something doctors also did not understand. Mary's life in the 1890s and 1900s involved frequent travel. George liked Sandringham and country life. Mary preferred London, so they split their time between both. They traveled abroad often. In 1901, they went on an extended tour of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They had just returned when Queen Victoria died on the 22nd of January, 1901. She was 81 years old. Her son, Edward, succeeded her as King Edward VII. He was 59 years old and in poor health from years of smoking and excess. George now became heir to the throne. He would not have to wait 59 years like his father. Mary would soon become Queen Consort and Empress of India. Their status as Prince and Princess of Wales meant more royal engagements. In 1905, they traveled to India, the British Raj. The following year, they visited Madrid for a royal wedding. King Edward VII died on May 6, 1910, at 68 years of age. George immediately became King George V of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India. Mary became Queen Consort and Empress of India. Although her baptismal name was Victoria, she adopted the regal name Mary. She did this out of respect for her cousin, Queen Victoria. Their coronation did not happen until the 22nd of June, 1911. The 14-month delay was because Britain was in a constitutional crisis when George became king in the summer of 1910. The monarchy was somewhat compromised by the outbreak of the First World War. This was owing to the close relations between Europe's major royal families. By the early 20th century, nearly all of the royal houses were intermarried. King George V of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia were all first cousins. Moreover, the king's paternal grandfather, Queen Victoria's husband, had been Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. This was a prominent German royal line. George and his family members still bore this title in 1914. Additionally, his wife, Mary, although she had been born in England, was the daughter of the Duke of Teck within the German aristocracy. All of this created an embarrassing impression when the war broke out. Many people felt that the royal family were more German than English when their bloodlines were examined. Certain sections of the British press hammered away at this point endlessly. Thus, in July 1917, George caved to public pressure. He issued a royal proclamation which changed the name of the royal house. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha became the House of Windsor. Windsor was a place long associated with the royal family. Windsor Castle had been built as a royal residence all the way back in the days of William the Conqueror in the 11th century. Ironically, William himself was a continental foreigner who conquered England. Beyond the concerns over German connections, George and his family members had a significant role to play in the conflict. Hundreds of members of the royal household and staff were enlisted in the war effort. For instance, the woodcutters from the Windsor Castle estate were sent to France as trench sappers. George himself first visited the trenches of northwest France in November 1914. This was the first of 5 such visits during the war. Queen Mary joined him in 1917. Back in Britain, the King and Queen spent much of the mid-19-teens visiting hospitals, nurses' stations, and clearinghouses. They met with wounded and discharged soldiers and sailors. George's 2 eldest sons, Edward and Albert, were also old enough to be involved in the armed forces. Edward served in France and was awarded the Military Cross. Albert served in the Royal Navy and was mentioned in dispatches for his role in the Battle of Jutland in 1916. This was the foremost naval engagement of the war between the British and German navies. While care was taken to ensure that the heir and his younger brother were not placed at the front line, the fact that the king's sons were on active duty helped cement the idea that the war was everyone's conflict. It was not just the lot of the average conscript. One of George's visits to France was to acknowledge the intensification of the conflict. For 2 years, the Germans had been pressing towards Paris from Belgium. For 2 years, the French and British, along with extensive detachments of Commonwealth soldiers from Canada, South Africa, India, Australia, and elsewhere, had pushed back. Then, in the summer of 1916, the British and French launched the Somme offensive against the German lines. The first day of the offensive, the 1st of July 1916, led to the greatest number of casualties experienced by the British Army in history. In one day, over 19,000 soldiers were killed. A further 38,000 were wounded or otherwise unable to fight. Plans were quickly put in place for George to cross to France. On the 10th of August 1916, with the fighting still raging, he visited troops at Etaples. He proceeded further down the British lines along the Somme. Curiously, he also met with General Henry Rawlinson, the commander of the British Second Army. The king conversed with him about efforts within the military to have General Douglas Haig, the commander of British forces in France, replaced. Yet this never materialized. Haig remained in overall control of the British Expeditionary Force. The slaughter at the Somme continued, eventually resulting in the deaths of approximately 300,000 troops. Yet the stalemate in the war was not broken. 2 more years of trench warfare in northeastern France would follow. While there was no change in military leadership in 1916, there was a change in the government back home in Britain. At the outset of the war, in 1914, the Liberal Party, led by Herbert Asquith, had a tenuous hold in power. To gain increased political stability during wartime, a unity government was formed. The Conservatives were granted numerous important ministries. The Labour Party, still viewed as a dangerous socialist movement by many, was even invited to join the government. However, by late 1916, Asquith's coalition was increasingly unpopular. It faced growing opposition over its prosecution of the war, notably the costliness in lives and resources of the Somme offensive. Asquith was eventually ousted from power in December 1916. The Secretary of State for War, David Lloyd George, formed a new unity coalition and became Prime Minister. By the early 20th century, the king had little say in these matters. George accepted Lloyd George as the new prime minister, but it would be a tense relationship between the pair at times in the years that followed. The conservative George was often at odds with the radical Welsh prime minister over policy in France, Ireland, and elsewhere. Moreover, recent studies have revealed the extent to which George involved himself in the politics of the British Army in France. This often saw him and Lloyd George intriguing against each other. Lloyd George was convinced that Haig should not continue as head of British forces in France. He sought to strengthen the position of the French general and supreme Allied commander, Ferdinand Foch, at Haig's expense. Such actions aside, both George and Lloyd George's efforts to intervene in the military handling of the war were rendered largely null and void when the United States joined the war on the side of Britain and France in April 1917. This made German defeat in the long run an all but certainty. Lloyd George and the king also clashed on another problematic matter, which arose internationally in 1917. This concerned events in Russia, where a revolution had been initiated to overthrow the government of George's cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, in February. This was a relatively conservative revolution at first. There was the possibility of the Russian royal family being able to escape from Russia and seek asylum elsewhere in Europe. At first, George was anxious to offer Nicholas the option of resettling, at least temporarily, in Britain, but Lloyd George was vehemently opposed. The Prime Minister believed that the presence of the Russian imperial family in England could act as a lightning rod for socialist and revolutionary elements. These groups were looking at Russia and considering whether an overthrow of the political system in Britain might also be possible. There were also concerns that the presence of the deposed Tsar in England could entangle Britain in Russia's domestic politics. In the end, the king came to agree with Lloyd George's viewpoint, although the British Secret Services nevertheless prepared a plan for how to rescue Nicholas and his family from Russia. That plan was never put into action. In the end, a more radical second revolution struck Russia in October 1917, bringing the Bolshevik communists to power. The Tsar and his family were murdered on the orders of the new government in the summer of 1918.